The first thing I noticed that morning was how confident my brother looked. Courtrooms have a particular silence before a hearing begins. Papers shifting, chairs scraping softly against the floor, lawyers murmuring in low, careful voices. But Daniel sat there like someone who had already finished the story in his head. When our eyes met, he didn't look angry. He looked satisfied. The allegation was simple, almost boring in the way it was written on the docket: practicing law without authorization, unauthorized representation, fraudulent legal activity. The words sounded heavier than the reality behind them. But that was the point. Words like that stain a reputation long before anyone proves them wrong. Daniel stood when the clerk called the matter. His voice carried easily across the room. He explained how I had been helping people with legal matters, advising them, preparing documents. According to him, I had built a quiet business, pretending to be something I wasn't. He spoke like someone who had rehearsed the speech in the mirror. What surprised me wasn't the accusation. Daniel had been suspicious of me for years. What surprised me was that he brought it here. Family arguments usually stay in kitchens and living rooms. They don't end up under fluorescent courtroom lights. The judge listened without interruption. His expression stayed neutral, the way judges are trained to keep it. When Daniel finished, the room waited for my response. I didn't say anything. The judge looked at me over his glasses. "Do you wish to respond?" I slid a folder across the table to the clerk. "That file should answer the court's questions." My voice sounded calmer than I felt. The clerk carried the folder to the bench. The judge opened it slowly, like someone expecting routine paperwork, maybe a license, maybe correspondence, something ordinary that would settle the dispute one way or another. For the first few seconds, nothing changed. Then the judge's posture shifted. It was subtle at first, his shoulders tightening slightly, his eyes moving back across a page he had already read. He turned another sheet. The color drained from his face so quickly it was almost physical. For a moment, he simply stared at the documents, completely still. The room had gone quiet in the way rooms do when everyone senses something has changed but doesn't yet understand how. Then the judge closed the folder. Without looking at either of us, he stood up. "I need a moment." And he disappeared through the door behind the bench into his chambers. No explanation, no instruction, just gone. The courtroom filled with whispers almost instantly. Daniel shifted in his chair. His confidence had faded, replaced by a tightness around his mouth that I hadn't seen when the hearing started. "What's in that file?" he asked under his breath. I didn't answer. Across the room, two attorneys leaned toward each other, speculating quietly. The clerk avoided eye contact with everyone. Minutes passed. They felt longer than the entire hearing had. I knew what the judge had seen. I had known the moment he opened the folder, but I hadn't wanted to say it myself. Eventually, the door opened again. The judge returned to the bench with a very different expression than the one he'd had before he left. Not anger, something closer to careful control. He looked first at Daniel, then at me. "Before this court proceeds," he said slowly, "certain records will need to be verified." He tapped the folder once with 2 fingers. "The documents provided indicate that the individual accused here is operating under a federal authorization structure connected to investigative legal support work." A quiet ripple moved through the room. The judge continued, "In other words, the activities described in this complaint are not unauthorized. They are supervised." Daniel stared at him. I could see the moment the realization reached him. Not just that he had been wrong, but that he had forced the court to examine records that normally stayed buried behind several layers of paperwork. The judge turned another page. "There are also confidentiality provisions here," he added, almost to himself. He closed the folder again. "This court will not be discussing the contents of these materials further." Daniel's face had gone pale now, too. He tried to speak but stopped halfway through the sentence. The judge's voice remained calm. "The accusation presented today is unsupported by the documentation reviewed by the court." That was all. No lecture, no dramatic ruling, just a statement that shifted the entire room. Daniel sat back slowly, as if something inside him had come loose. The hearing ended shortly after that. Papers were gathered. Chairs moved. The quiet machinery of the courtroom resumed its normal rhythm. I stood and collected the folder. Daniel didn't look at me as we walked toward the door. Outside the courthouse, the evening air felt colder than it had that morning. For a moment we stood on the steps together, neither of us speaking. Finally, he said, almost quietly, "You could have told me." I thought about that, about the years of suspicion, the arguments that never quite resolved, the way he had looked at me in the courtroom, already certain he knew the truth. "I did tell you," I said, just not in a way he believed. I walked down the steps and into the crowd without looking back. Some things, once brought into the open like that, don't really go back to what they were before. And sometimes being proven right doesn't feel much like winning.